I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to a new series, the Top 10s of the 2010s, a weekly series I'm going to be doing where I break down some of my favorite movies of the decade. Essentially, the show is I'm going to be breaking down my top 10 lists in a bunch of different genres. Action is going to be this week, next week's going to be romance, the week after that sci-fi, fantasy, and so on, going from 10 to 7 one week to 6 to 2 the next week, and then a whole episode dedicated to the first best movie, best action movie of the decade, the best romance movie of the decade, and then of course at the very end of this whole journey I'm going to be giving you my sort of favorite and what I consider the best movies of the decade. But I decided to make this into different genres to highlight some movies that maybe haven't been talked about a lot. And my whole philosophy for this video is going to be trying a lot of new things. It may try to include a lot more clips, maybe less so of the on-camera stuff, but I'm going to be experimenting, and I hope you come along with this journey. But essentially how my sort of main philosophy of how I'm going to approach these lists, which I'm going to say at the top and then, sort of interspersed throughout these videos, is the idea that when I pick these movies, they're not necessarily what I consider maybe even the best action movies of the year, but they're also not maybe my all-time favorite movies of the decade. All these movies I definitely like, if not love, and recommend to you. They're all movies that were released anywhere between January 1st, 2010 to December 2019. And they're a little bit of a mix of, cultural relevance and my personal favorites and the sort of melding of the two. But, I may have a movie that you think is the best action movie of the decade and is sort of seen critically as the best action movie of the decade, but it may not be my personal favorite. It may not be the one I go back to. So I'm not going to put it at number one just because everyone else says it's the best. For me, it's the consensus best. This is all about sort of, in a lot of ways, my opinions, my unique sort of takes and approaches, because a lot of the reason why I wanted to do this series was seeing some of the top 10 movies of the decade lists across the internet, and so many of them were so similar. So many of them had these sort of key movies that are going to be on the list that I actually think are going to be movies that we talk about for years to come, but they didn't sort of add in that personal aspect, which I think is so important for movies. And I hope to have a unique opinion, and if you've been seeing some of my Connor's videos for the past few years, I don't always just pick the best picture winner or the critical consensus of the best movie of the year. Even if I may like those movies, I have my own taste, and for some reason certain movies hit over another. And a large reason why I started this channel is to create a great film community. In the comments down below, just giving your thoughts. So every week I encourage you to give me your top 10 action movies, for example, or your 10 to 7, or some movies you really like, or just some movies that maybe I haven't seen that you want to talk about. Now, I have seen a lot. This was a decade where I became an avid film goer and real film lover. So I've been doing a lot of research as well in terms of catching up on movies that I haven't seen to compile this list, and even movies that didn't get great reviews, to see if actually this is something that hits me. And actually I think that I really like this one, because even though it has a 43% on Rotten Tomatoes, especially for something like an action movie, I really relate to that one. I actually think that's a really well done action movie. But starting off, like every 10 to 7 video, I'm going to be talking about some honorable mentions. As a whole, I think I'm going to stick to them just to 5 for each genre topic that I'm going to be doing every month or so. So starting off with them in alphabetical order, I have Two Guns. This is an incredible movie, a movie that I don't think a lot of people have seen, but just one that's filled with charisma. I did a podcast on it called Connor the Contrarian a while back, about a couple summers ago, where I talked about this movie, and I really went in depth. So if you want to hear an in-depth analysis, check out the channel there for the Connor the Contrarian podcast. But really what I love about the movie is this charisma between Denzel and Mark Wahlberg, just a movie star power. It's got a complicated, twisty, turning plot, but the buddy cop back and forth between Denzel and Mark Wahlberg is some of the best of the decade, in my opinion. Right there with Ryan Gosling and Russell Crowe for Nice Guys, for example, or other great sort of duos. I actually think this is up there, and not a lot of people have seen it or have really critically appreciate it. So I thought Two Guns definitely deserved at least a spot on the honorable mentions, but that's definitely not even necessarily a guilty pleasure, because I don't believe in that, but a movie that I really like, that I think is actually really well done, and just hasn't had the incredible critical appreciation that I think it deserves. Then we have Jack Reacher, which is sort of a sleeper hit. I'm a big Tom Cruise fan, and I think he's doing great stuff, especially within the action genre, because that's what he's pretty much exclusively done within this decade. But Jack Reacher is a great sort of conspiracy-type thriller for the modern-day ages. It definitely sort of hones into, I think, this sort of mindset that reminisces very much similar to, I think, the 70s, which is this almost a conspiracy-minded, a skepticism of the government and of the people behind it, and sort of like there's always one thing that you don't know that's going on, you know, whether it be something like the Jeffrey Epstein thing going on, or just general distrust within the government. I think this sort of actually is a great movie for these times, and it's kind of an action movie because it has these action moments and, you know, shootouts and things like that, so I would consider it an action movie, but in a lot of ways it's a thriller, and just a fun one because, you know, it's similar to like a John Wick where when everyone says Jack Reacher's name, it's like, uh-oh, you don't want to mess with him. He's Jack Reacher. He's the man. And Tom Cruise just totally embodies that badass kind of a element, but also has this really compelling, interesting thriller element. You know, they didn't make a sequel, but I'd like to see Christopher McQuarrie, who worked with, you know, Tom in the most recent Mission Impossible movies, come back to do maybe another Jack Reacher and create a different sort of angle, because I'm definitely a fan of this series. Then we have Upgrade, which is a movie I had seen not too recently. It only came out last year, a year and a half ago, I guess. But it's an awesome movie from director Lee Bunnell, and his most recent movie is going to be coming out soon, The Invisible Man, starring Elizabeth Moss. He's an incredible director, and this movie is definitely sort of a low budget in terms of it doesn't have these major stars or anything like that, but it has incredible ideas and thoughts and some unique ways to filming action. Essentially what they did is they like rigged the camera to motion track with movements of the actor, because if you don't know, the story is about a man who gets implanted with a chip. He becomes paralyzed, he gets implanted with a chip, and then sort of a revenge for his wife, but this chip is actually controlling him in a lot of ways and tells him what to do, or can take over his body and become sort of a great fighter. So on this sort of revenge path, you have these incredible action sequences where he just moves like a robot in very unique ways. And then just all the concepts of things that you would realistically see, like things getting chips implanted into our minds, like self-driving cars, like this sort of dystopian world that they've created, and some of the philosophical things that they bring up. It's an awesome action movie, a great watch, and I was just pumping my fist the entire time. I really wanted to get this on the list, but there's been plenty of great action movies, so even though it's an honorable mention, even though it's not in the top 10, all these movies that I recommend are definitely, you know, high recommendations for me. Then we have White House Down, another movie I think has maybe gotten lost at times, but definitely shouldn't have. This was a movie that when it was released was sort of compared to Olympus Has Fallen, because they were both really summer blockbusters, of which there were attacks on the White House, and Hollywood does this every once in a while, whether it be last year with, you know, the Fire Festival with Hulu and Netflix, or even back to Armageddon and Deep Impact. For some reason, there's similar ideas that come out in similar times, and inevitably they get sort of paired against each other in the general consciousness, and there's always which one do you like better. Personally, I guess I would say I like White House Down better, but Olympus Has Fallen is actually a great movie, and of course they did the other Fallen sequels and really sort of milk that franchise. But White House Down, I definitely like that sort of relationship between Channing Tatum's character and Jamie Foxx's character. I mean, similar to Two Guns, these guys are two massive movie stars, and they know a lot of ways how to have fun, and I think they know what kind of a movie they're in. It's incredibly over the top. It's Roland Emmerich. It's insane, but it also actually has sort of a Die Hard-esque kind of a structure, but in the White House. So in a lot of ways, it's actually really perfectly set up, and the payoffs are very clear, and the story's really engaging because you know where everyone is in terms of the spatial geography of the White House. And then you have these incredible, I mean, massive, epic kind of action sequences that are Michael Bay-esque. So with an incredibly tight structure, with some awesome action and massive sort of big action sequences, it's sort of a great rah-rah American 4th of July, but I also think actually kind of undercuts that in a lot of ways. But it's still an awesome sort of movie at the end of the day, and especially if you're an American, I definitely think you would relate to this one particularly, and I think it's just a really great fun time. And then my last pick is Widows. Now, a lot of people, you know, would say, oh, Steve McQueen, he's doing something to the action genre. It's going to be great, and it was. This is a movie that had a lot on its mind, yes, and you know, sometimes I feel like that maybe brings down its overall pace and its speed in terms of that thrilling aspect that you need, but it is maybe the most beautifully shot action movie I think of out of all these lists. It's stunning in every sense. There's incredibly smart camera work, but that Steve McQueen does, very subtle sort of smart things. But then there's some incredibly painterly type shots of just Chicago skylines, or there's a great sort of circling shot with Daniel Kaluuya in a gym, and just really every frame that they that's put onto screen is this really rich, unique element, and just smart directorial choices that Steve McQueen does. If you think of sort of a car scene that goes from one area of Chicago to Jack's house, there is a lot trying to say within this movie. Everyone's sort of morally complex and gray, and there's ignorance, but then there's love, and sort of really intertwined aspect between those two, and sort of confronting your life that you once thought but now is totally different. It's just an incredible ensemble cast, from Elizabeth Debicki to Viola Davis. It's an awesome movie. It's so beautifully shot, and not often do we see sort of the urban action movies in a lot of ways, and this one definitely hits that mark. And definitely check out Widows if maybe it sort of got slipped in the Oscar season last year. It's an awesome movie, and I think one people are going to be really appreciating for years to come. Now, going into my number 10 pick. For the 10th best action movie of the 2010s, I'm going to go with Kingsman, The Secret Service.
Manners maketh man. Do you know what that means? Then let me teach you a lesson. Are we going to stand around here all day, or are we going to fight?
Now, this is a franchise in a lot of ways that encapsulates what I think of with the 2010s, which is this idea of a meta subversion. What Kingsman does is essentially take the James Bond narrative and the myth and sort of the elements that people like about that, but then flips it on its head. It pays homage to a lot of those things, but then sometimes undercuts it, or sometimes does something different that is specifically, against that sort of traditional James Bond-esque suave area that maybe hasn't aged the best. So it definitely takes some of the great elements, but then understands, what it needs to do to make it modern, and Kingsman really succeeds with that way, because that's what Kingsman did for the action franchise, but Deadpool did that for the superhero, 21 Jump Street did that for the old cop show, even something like the Lego Movie, and really just in general what Phil Lord and Chris Miller have been doing are in a lot of ways what I sort of see this decade has been, which is very people recognize using sort of the history of movies to now influence this next generation of movies. But Kingsman is not just a meta James Bond ripoff. It actually has an incredible lore that it's built and based off of from the Mark Millar comic book. Just the fact of the Kingsman actual suit store, which has all the gadgets and things like that are just very cool. It really has a great structure, because it starts off with this idea that there is a secret world, and we're being introduced to it through Eggsy's eyes, and he's sort of amazed by the different gadgets and things like that, and then of course the test that he has to do to become a Kingsman. It's very much Men in Black-esque in a lot of ways too, but then once he does actually get through that sort of gauntlet, but now of course there's a bad guy, now there's a threat to that sort of existing structure that we were so interested in. So we get introduced to this world, and of course that sort of last, I say, 2/3 of the movie, with the bad guy played by Samuel Jackson in an all-time great performance with a great lisp, is menacing and interesting, and very much has that global warming kind of evil villain logic that a lot of villains actually have in this decade, coincidentally enough. But then by the time end of it, you only have a few action sequences, and it's over so quick, and you just want more, which is why I think they really invested in the Secret Service, and then later on the Kingsman. But once we do have that, we have awesome action sequences, and action sequences that I actually haven't really seen since. What Upgrade does in terms of the body tracking, Kingsman almost takes to another level, where through reliance of heavy visual effects and incredible choreography, oftentimes there's these one-take action sequences that uses the gadgets. I'm thinking of the pub sequence, which is just classy and cool, that Colin Firth's character Harry does in the bar, beating up those kids, has this sort of sweeping kind of a camera that moves around the space in almost a floaty way, but almost a very engaging and unique way that other action sequences haven't done. And then of course the legendary church scene, which just blew me away in a lot of ways, of this massive slaughter of all these mind-controlled churchgoers. So you have this incredible villain, which you sort of side with in some ways, but he's also kind of over the top and crazy. You have Taron Egerton in a star-shining performance as Eggsy, and then that Colin Firth mentor relationship. It has an incredible, unique camera style that is unlike anything I've seen before, and really uses modern day technology to create a different type of action sequence. It's something that has influenced, I think, a lot of people this decade, and I think actually a lot of people I talked to really appreciate this movie and are really into this movie, and that's the reason why, you know, these sequels have persisted and why they keep on investing in this franchise. Then for number 9, we have The Accountant.
Do you like puzzles? Tell me what you see. Was taken 3 years ago by an undercover agent.
It's the same person.
He was spotted in Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Naples. This guy risks his life uncooking the books for some of the scariest people on the planet. Drug cartels, arms brokers, money launderers, assassins. Who survives this kind of clientele? Imagine the secrets this guy has.
A movie that came out, did well, but maybe not well enough to garner a sequel, had some mixed critical response, but the people who have seen it, I've had multiple occasions where people have come up to me and told me, yeah, I just saw The Accountant, and I was really impressed, I thought it was very good, and you know, I totally agree with them, because I really appreciated what this film did in terms of having a great sort of main protagonist, and then the way it actually structures its action sequences was very impressive. So it starts off with actually what I consider a great protagonist in Christian Wolff. And now some people, I know there's some controversy in terms of the autistic sort of elements of it, which is a sensitive topic, but you know, I can only speak for my opinion and my experience, but I thought it was handled sensitively actually, and didn't sort of go into the trope, where I know there's actually a lot of tropes recently where Hollywood has thought that, oh, if you have autism, you can do math really quickly, and then therefore that can lead to something else, and now you have superpowers, which I actually think this film doesn't do. I think it actually goes out of its way a lot of times to bring in that element as a form of sympathy in a lot of ways, but also in explaining that he's not a superhero, that he's incredibly gifted in terms of his accounting and his ability to comprehend math, but then in terms of the action sequences, he was trained and since he was a kid and actually learned that way, and that he's not just a superpower because he has autism, now he knows how to do everything else. He has limits, he has limitations, which is what I think makes him such a great protagonist, because whether you're looking at a John McClane or Indiana Jones, yes, they have this sort of confidence exterior that they think they're the best and they're almost blindly courageous, but they often have weaknesses and they're often scared, and we see that in the performances of Bruce Willis and Harrison Ford, that, you know, they're not 100% there, and they actually have some vulnerabilities. And I actually think that this film doesn't get enough credit for Christian Wolff's vulnerabilities, because his entire life he's sort of gone by this sort of logical fact, and you know, he hasn't strayed away from things that don't necessarily make logical sense. But of course, in this way, we see a transformation. We see his interaction with Anna Kendrick, which has some funny sort of banter between the two. But then he actually sort of goes against his logical sense for this girl, you know, that sort of emotional vulnerability that he has. And we actually see when his relationships that he has built as an accountant living this life get threatened, he's the first one to help out. And even though he maybe suffers from social relationships, he actually has done the work to develop these relationships, and the movie actually shows that he does care, that he's not this, you know, mind-killing robot, that he actually has feelings, that he's not just, he has incredible skills and he's incredibly smart, but he also has some flaws to make him very human. Now the plot, in my opinion, is kind of absurd and very hard to follow, but for the most part I think the major plot points are kind of easy enough to be like, okay, this happens, okay, now I understand what's happening here, and when reveals happen you go, oh, okay, I do understand that, even if I don't understand the complete intricacies of everything. But what I do actually like is not the specifics of the plot necessarily, but the structure of the plot. The idea that there's this FBI or IRA sort of narrative, and that's one structure where the IRA are trying to crack down this guy's taxes because he's sort of an elusive figure, and then he, you know, of course he's killing people, so they're working with the FBI. And then you also have, of course, Christian Wolff sort of experience living his day-to-day life, working with this huge tech company on their accounting. And then, of course, you have the people coming after him in the hired mercenaries that are coming after him by who knows who, or sometimes it's the FBI, sometimes it's the eventual company that he worked for. So it has this sort of great three-structured plot where he's not necessarily the good guy, and then these are the bad guys. There's the bad guys, he is kind of, I guess, the good guy, he's our protagonist, he's our hero, but then of course the actual government's coming after him too. But then how that sort of storyline plays out in terms of the confrontation, in terms of the realization, in terms of sort of moral issues, that actually brings a lot of weight and sort of thought to the movie, is great. But then, of course, the action sequences are awesome too. You have whether it be not necessarily huge like White House Down, it's actually smaller in a lot of ways, but and they're grounded in reality, but still very cool. Whether it be the impressive farm sequence, where what I love about the action sequences is that they're actually very propulsive, and that one thing leads to the next, which leads to the next, and there's almost a continuous sort of flow, which I very appreciate about this movie. Where if you take that farm sequence, they start off in the house, and then they go to the field, and they go to the truck, and then they go to near the tree, and they sort of one to the next, and sort of moving locations, and it's not necessarily even a chase as it is just sort of a meeting of forces. And if White House Down is sort of the go guns blazing, if we're using a video game term, this is sort of the stealth mode. This is going in, Christian Wolff being very smart, getting the people, almost being like a ninja-esque, you know, because he is sort of this incredibly well-gifted killer and assassin. So even though it's low stakes, even it's still stealthy, it's still engaging, and when he does sort of get confronted with something that he is almost overwhelming, we see that human side, we see the sympathies with him. I think there's a great sort of relationship with Anna Kendrick and that back and forth. It's just a movie that I think a lot of people do like and do appreciate. It's sort of a great Sunday afternoon movie. I definitely felt like that had to be a slot on this list, and The Accountant definitely fills that. Now, my number 8 pick is Edge of Tomorrow.
The invasion will fail, along with every soldier you are sending. We lose everything.
Come find me when you wake up!
Now, throughout the series, I'm going to be making certain decisions and picks where I consider one movie a sci-fi movie, or I consider another movie an action movie. So, you know, we haven't given the full list, so of course I'm probably going to be talking about maybe some obvious movies later down the road that I don't want to spoil. But there may be some movies that I may have missed, so let me know in the comments down below. But those may be movies I consider more sci-fi. You know, in this case, for example, I consider Edge of Tomorrow not sci-fi, even though it has a, you know, incredible sci-fi element. I consider it more of an action movie, therefore I put it in the action genre. So sometimes they bleed into different categories, but ultimately I have made an executive decision as to where things will be put. So sometimes, if it may be a glaring omission may be missing from the list, maybe wait a few weeks and it's going to be coming in the sci-fi, or it's going to be coming in the comedy episode, for example. But in this case, for this movie, what's unique about it is that it actually has an incredible deep sci-fi element on top of a really unique action storyline. The sci-fi element is based off the graphic novel, and not only does it have sort of a incredible, deep-rooted sense to the story, it also has great design and a great world with this sort of post-apocalyptic alien invasion type thing, but we're not at the beginning of the alien invasion. We've been in there for a while. We've had these wars. It's a full-out sort of global scale. To even just the incredible designs, the unique alien designs that are different and untraditional that we've seen before, and these octopus type, almost incredibly fast things that swallow people. It's a unique way to use a sci-fi to explain and enhance and make this action totally different. But of course, the main sort of driving action factor is that this is sort of a Groundhog Day for action movies, where Tom Cruise dies in battle, and then he is reborn the next day, and he has to redo the next day until he has to beat the battle or go do something, you know, has the task that, you know, I don't want to spoil it in case you haven't seen it, because it's an awesome movie. It's one that I think has definitely connected with a lot of people, and definitely connected with me. And why I like it so much is actually because of the Tom Cruise performance, which is, I think, maybe his best performance of the decade, and definitely his best performance in many years. He's unlike the, say, Jack Reacher, total badass who does anything wrong, because he's a total coward. He's a major who is a PR guy. You know, he was not. He's a guy who's trying to sell the war. He's not someone who's going to fight in the war. But then when he gets put into the war, he gets, you know, treated like a private, and just totally out of his element, and every chance he gets he's trying to leave the war, because he is a coward, and he's a guy who doesn't want to even attempt to fight for his country. So the film actually doesn't do a great job to lionize him, and doesn't actually crap on him a lot because he's a coward, but he definitely makes him relatable for that reason. He's not this awesome badass killing machine. He goes from this private, kind of a weak kind of a guy, eventually, you know, working his way to try to become a great action hero by the end of the movie, with sort of the assistance of the great, already badass Emily Blunt. Now, she should get an Oscar for this movie just because of her chemistry with Tom Cruise, which has had, you know, Tom Cruise sort of infamously has had trouble establishing relationships with leading females, that there's only a few people that has really worked that way. Something like Renee Zellweger sticks to mind, but Emily Blunt definitely does that. Now, is there sort of a romantic element? Maybe, but not super forced down. It's much more of a respect and admiration and empathy for each other. She starts off as this, great, a badass kind of a action hero who still needs help, who still needs the assistance, who still feels like there's more that she can do. And through that sort of back and forth, also so much something like a Kingsman has great structure, has these sort of training elements of these sort of comedic elements that they use with Groundhog Day, to the sort of great stake at the end. But it's not just the sort of comedic Groundhog Day action where you know it's going to end. They actually explore some of the scenes that are sort of, where Groundhog Day is a dark comedy. They explore this structure to use as almost a philosophical argument of how much, what a life is worth, and what actually happens to this person who goes through these things over and over, and sort of the pessimism and cynicism that's built up and occurs, especially if you're in Tom Cruise's sense, because you've done this hundreds of times and it hasn't worked and it keeps on failing. And in a lot of ways, it's a story about failure. It's a story about trying to overcome that and the incredible the effort and the hard work that it takes, also talking about sort of philosophical things of cynicism, of empathy, of what a life is worth. So there is a lot more to think about aside from these unique designs, which have these great World War II Saving Private Ryan beach sequences with the awesome exoskeletons, which is just an awesome image in terms of design, and all the elements in the world that was built is incredibly visually engaging, with also having these great themes, with also having incredible back and forth and characters, with Tom Cruise, one of the incredible best performances in years, Emily Blunt holding her own and doing just as well, if not better than him in the movie. Two awesome movie stars in a great, unique sci-fi action movie that is one of the best, in my opinion, of the decade. And my number 7 pick is Fast 5.
Doesn't change a thing. Chances are, sooner or later, we're gonna end up behind bars or buried in a ditch somewhere. But not today.
It's all about family in the Fast and Furious franchise, and this one, I think, gets it the best. In my opinion, Fast 5 is the sort of consensus best in the franchise, and in my opinion, is also the best in the franchise. Not only does it work as a great sort of sequel to all the previous 4 movies, combining them all and getting the best elements from each one, putting them into one movie, also has the addition of The Rock. Also totally, I think, nails the tone of this movie. But I think it actually works as a standalone movie. Now, I saw this one as my very first Fast and Furious movie and definitely liked it. I was like, oh, this is a really cool sort of, heist movie that works really well. But, it was in a lot of ways maybe a little bit generic. But what I didn't realize, and what I think makes the Fast and Furious franchise unique, is that this was the 5th movie. That this wasn't a first one that we just were introduced to these characters. That they have this backstory, similar to maybe the Marvel movies or a TV show that we had 1, 2, 3, and 4, where the characters weren't together, that they were sort of interspersed, Han in Tokyo Drift, and then of course, Brian in 2, and then Dom, of course, in, I guess, the first one, I think he's sort of the main character, but then just doesn't come back until the 4th one, where they sort of all come together. But this one, I think, nails the tone of what Fast and Furious is to come, where it's definitely taking itself serious, and it's definitely fun, but it's not taking itself too serious. It understands the incredible death-defying stunts that they're doing, but in my opinion, doesn't go so much like a superhero movie that I think, 6 and 7, especially 8, maybe go a little bit too far. I think some people like that sort of crazy absurdistness, but in terms of the great balance, in my opinion, is this one, because it's still a racing movie. It still has the car elements, but now they're criminals. They're off the map now. You have an incredible ensemble, whether it be Dom, whether it be Han, or Brian, or any of the other Ludacris. Their dynamic, it definitely feels like a family. It's a friendship, but a family that they sort of have made themselves, interspersed from all the different movies now coming together. Rock brings some incredible sort of comedic presence to the movie. But what about the action? Well, this movie actually has great action. In a lot of ways, it's kinetic because it's moving from one thing to the next. oftentimes they did throughout the 4 movies car chase sequences, and there's a car chase sequence in this because it's a car-based movie. That's the best sort of way to show car action, which is car chases. But also they've also incorporated chase into other things, like the Havana rooftop sort of chase, but now that's on foot. So it's not all about cars, so you don't have to love cars to be related to these movies, but still you can appreciate that sort of kinetic pace of it. And why I actually think it has held up since 2011, you know, is the fact that they relied so heavily on practical effects. When they're dragging that safe around, that's not a CGI safe, that's a real safe that they're sort of, you know, there's a car inside of it that's sort of driving along with it, but it looks super real when they're going through the streets because it's not fake, because they actually did do a lot of that stuff. But ultimately, I mean, as cheesy as it sounds, with this great family, with this sort of great ensemble that is in this movie, you definitely feel those familial aspects. You definitely feel the sort of bond or relationship that these people have within each other, this family that they've built. So while it's a sort of a good standalone heist movie, if you see the other movies and then you see this movie, it just brings all the great elements of those into this one. It's a movie that has these great sort of sequences that you can watch on TV that you sort of want to throw on because they're sort of segmented in these really great ways. It's an awesome movie. It's one of the best action movies of the decade. I really liked it. For some people, maybe it's the number one. Maybe my disinterest in the later Fast and Furious movies and my sort of mixed opinion on them as a whole, but this one is the reason why I like this franchise. This is the one that came together and made it such a huge deal. But that's about it, guys. Stay tuned next week for my picks from 6 to 2, where I'll do the same sort of thing, but maybe a little bit more in depth. I'm going to be experimenting with how these videos are going to look in terms of the amount of visuals of myself talking on screen versus the different clips and things I want to put in the movies. But please let me know in the comments below what you thought of this first episode and some of your favorite action movies of the decade, or maybe in honor of this episode, movies that maybe people haven't seen that are somewhat action-y but that probably maybe wouldn't have made the list just because they're a little bit underseen. You know, something like 13 Assassins is a great movie which just made the list, unfortunately didn't make the list. A Prayer Before Dawn is another one I really liked, which if you consider, that's more, I guess, drama, action. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to classify them. You know, I didn't really put in any boxing movies in here, so maybe that's, you know, I wouldn't consider the action movie. That's something totally different, so hard to debate in terms of that. But please let me know in the comments down below and give your thoughts and subscribe to the channel so you can join me for the next 8 months on this incredible journey. That's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.